Last time we ended with I hope you can recall that we had stopped with the widow's mite, okay? Jesus praising that widow who put her all, okay? How he says that, in those 2 coins, 2 small coins that she had put in the treasury of the temple. Okay, and I had shared with you the picture of how the treasuries in the temple were always in the form of the trumpets, and they were all laid out along the huge corridors. So people would come and put in their offerings. And Jesus very closely was observing this at the end of the day, with many people who were coming and making lavish, show of what they were offering. But this poor woman comes and puts those 2 small coins, and how Jesus, actually he is offering her, okay, as a counter example to the disciples. Even the disciples are no match to her spirit of total dependence on the providence of God. And with that, the entire scene of the temple with that chapter 12 closes. Okay, and then we have chapter 13, which is it is a very famous chapter of the Gospel of Mark, because it is the decisive verse, this chapter 13, and the first few verses of chapter 13, that showed that it gave a very strong indication, and it was sort of an internal proof of the gospel, that this gospel was written before the temple, the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in 70 AD. We have often during our sessions touched upon, how this event of 70 AD, when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed by the Romans, it was a very huge cataclysmic event, because it changed the entire face of Judaism, the Judaism of the Second Temple period as we knew, and with Jesus also experienced, it was no longer there post 70 AD. So today, this particular chapter 13, and especially the first few verses only today we will be concentrating on, and I will be sharing with you today, more than the gospel reflection, it will be the background that we need to explore and be familiar with, because without that social, political and the economic background of those events of 70 AD, we will not be able to make sense of what Jesus was actually, the message that he was conveying. And it was a very deeply eschatological message. It was an end time sort of a message. So all that will make sense only when we look deeply into the historical context of the burning of the temple in 70 AD. So let us start with the with the text of the gospel as usual. Put down. I think by now all of you are very familiar that the blue text, okay, blue slides, the slides with the blue background are always the scriptural text which we analyze later on. All the reflections and understandings, they are shared on the pink slides. So here we have, today we will be concentrating only on verse 1 to 4. The destruction of the temple foretold. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, what will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines, and this is but the beginning of the birth pangs." Jesus, he paints a very gloomy picture of the end times over here. Okay, and then he's making this prediction. Then one of the apostles, okay, he admires the large stones of the building. You must be wondering, Jesus has already made his entry into the temple, and he's had very headlong confrontations with the Jerusalem priesthood, with the scribes and all. So they have already made the entry, and definitely being Jews, okay, it was mandatory for them for the 3 assembly festivals, they had to make it to Jerusalem. If not for the remaining 2, then at least the Passover. And every observant Jew, once, he was 12 years old, okay, after they had that ceremony called the Bar Mitzvah, it was a formal induction into the Jewish community. So once that was done for a 12-year-old, he became a part of the community of Israel. And so it was mandatory for them to make this journey, especially those who were close. So definitely, the way like it is put out here by Mark, we have to remember that Mark is most probably not maybe the direct disciple, one of the disciples of Jesus, but definitely he was a disciple of Peter, and he was his secretary who was writing down all the preaching that Peter was doing in the Roman church community. And Mark has a very unique way of assembling his text. Most of the time, his main intention is to be very faithful to what Peter is preaching. So all the preaching of Peter is being gathered together in a textual format. So definitely this could have been earlier, we do not know, because the way this expression from one of the disciples, look teacher, what large stones and what large building. Definitely this expression must have come from one of the disciples, but maybe earlier when they were entering the temple, because the temple of Jerusalem was a very spectacular building, so much so that it was considered to be one of the wonders of the ancient world. When they talked about, temples being the wonders of the ancient world, there was one particular temple in the ancient world that nobody could beat. And we hear about that, Paul in the Acts of the Apostle, the temple of Artemis in Ephesus. That was a very beautifully built temple. They said that no temple could be, could beat the temple of Artemis, but that was built much centuries earlier. But this Jewish temple, which was, beautifully rebuilt, expanded on a huge plaza, it was a master stroke of Herod the Great, who was the one who was instrumental in transforming this building, the Jerusalem temple, into one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So when they started, when this disciple, whoever is not the disciple here is not named, okay, Mark now never uses the word apostles, he's always using the word disciples, or one of the 12. So who is the one, we do not know, he does not report. But when that person expresses awe and wonder at the huge size of the building and so magnificently that it was built, Jesus makes the prediction that not one stone will be left here upon the other. And these are exactly the words that did come true, because we know from the archaeological digs that are all going around Jerusalem, these huge stones, they are called ashlars, really very huge stones. The foundations, can literally be seen, and some of them, especially the part of the western wall, because those walls were far off. This is more the actual stones that were built, used to build a sanctuary within, which was much inside, beyond the walls. There were 3 walls surrounding, Jerusalem. You had the 3rd wall, the 2nd wall, and the 1st wall. So here he is remarking about the stones that made up the building, and Jesus makes this prediction which comes true. And he doesn't elaborate over here. This is as they were walking back. When they reach the Mount of Olives, remember this is the last week of Jesus' life. They are here, okay, very close to Bethany. So they are going back and forth from Bethany, and Mount of Olives was the famous spot where Jesus would always, retire for prayer, for solitude, and he would take his 4 disciples with him over there. So probably he was sitting over there and he was, having a very intimate talk with his disciples. And that time, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, 4 of them, they privately asked him, because they heard this, okay, that not one stone will be left here upon another. Tell us, what will this be? Okay, tell us when I mean, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished? And Jesus gives these signs, which are very difficult sometimes to interpret and make sense of, because what he talks is actually the coming of the end of age, because this seems to be, the language of the prophets, and especially the prophet Daniel. We know that Jesus often quoted from the book of Daniel. So this is exactly the visions of Daniel when, in the final act of God's justice, when he comes to be the ultimate ruler of the world, there would be signs, big signs that would accompany the coming of the Lord, the day of the Lord it was called. So Jesus exactly tells these things, okay, that these things will come. And then Jesus began to say to them, beware that no one leads you astray. There will be many who will come saying, I am he. What is the meaning of I am he? There will be many who will come claiming to be the messiahs, okay. We know that even after Jesus died, there were so many people who claimed that they were the messiahs. So there will be many who will come and lead many people astray, because the signs will be very confusing. But remember, it is still not the end, okay? The end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. So this is the final eschaton, the end of age, which Jesus also had predicted that this will be the day of last judgment, which will be there for the entire world. But still, this is not going to be the end of it. It is only going to be the beginning. So let us see what Jesus, okay, when he finally, Jesus died in 30 or maybe 33 AD, one of the two dates is held on. Many of them very strongly believe, the scholars, that it is most probably 33 AD that Jesus died. So he was probably a young man, okay, not less than 37 years of age, because we have to remember that Jesus was born before Herod died, and we know for sure that Herod died in the year 4 BC. So if Jesus was born in 5 BC or maybe even 6 BC, the older he would be. So whatever date you would like to hold on to, be it 30 or 33 AD, these are the events would finally, okay, almost after another 20 years and more, these things would come to be accomplished. And what finally, when these things really literally came to be accomplished, what were the things that, would precede all that? Let us have a look. For that, we need to delve a little into the background of all the events that built up, okay, to the burning of the temple. The background history to the build-up of events leading to the burning of the temple in 70 AD. This is all very historical data. So you have to know the context in which Jesus is talking, okay, and how his words come to, in the context in which it would actually occur. The catastrophic event to the burning of the second temple. Remember, the temple in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus was referred to as the second temple because the first one was already destroyed in 587 BC by Nebuchadnezzar, and then they were carried into exile. They came back, rebuilt the temple. But the rebuilt temple was not a very spectacular building, because it was very difficult for them to garner resources, and put up a magnificent temple which was, on par with what Solomon had built. So the first temple was a Solomonic temple, and the second temple was the one that was built by the exiles when they returned. So the catastrophic event of the burning of the second temple is to this day marked as a national day of mourning in the Jewish calendar. Even today, if you go, okay, to Jerusalem, you go to Israel and all, somewhere around the last week of August, I think it is on the 29th of August, at a particular time, there will be a gong that will go out, and it is a complete day of mourning. No businesses, the streets and everything will be emptied out. Why? Because it is a national day of mourning in the Jewish calendar. And on that day, they commemorate not only the falling of this temple, 70 AD, the second temple, it was around this time only, even the first temple, was destroyed. It's very strange, the coincidence in the timing. And they also mourn, okay, the Holocaust. in the Second World War, the Jews were, almost obliterated by Hitler and his men. So that is called the Shoah, that is called the mourning. Okay, it's a national mourning. The Jews mourn the demise of these two temples and the Holocaust that they had to suffer. But when you look at all the accounts, and especially the account, how we know, okay, in minute detail, okay, day to day, what actually happened, the drama that unfolded before the burning of the temple, it is all credit to the Jewish historian Josephus, Flavius Josephus. His story also is, very deeply connected. We will be dwelling into that also a little bit in the next session, coming Sunday or Monday, whatever. So here, this is considered to be the day of mourning. Why? Because this is something that the Jews will never forget, okay? Even the coming generations. It was a climactic event that changed the face of Judaism, completely giving birth to Rabbinic Judaism, the Judaism that is practiced by the Jews today. It is not the Judaism of the Second Temple period. It is not the Judaism that Jesus experienced when he lived there in Galilee and around Jerusalem. So the burning of the temple, from those ashes arose a new religion, Rabbinic Judaism as we know of today, replacing forever the sacrificial cult of the Jerusalem temple. It stopped and it was replaced by Torah learning and daily and weekly worship services, which continue till this day in the synagogues. To understand this event, we need to go back down in history to the complex love-hate relationship between Rome and Jerusalem. It was actually a clash of these two, clash of cultures of the people of these two mighty lands. Okay, for it was the complexities in the relationship between Rome and Judea over a little more than a century that brought about this cataclysmic downfall of the temple. Rome and Jerusalem, the crossing of paths and a clash of cultures. Let us see. To begin it, of course, there are, centuries of history before this, but the exact period when we talk about, this altercation between Rome and Jerusalem, the start date, we can very safely say it all began in 63 BC, okay? A little less than 60 years before Jesus came into this world. It all began in 63 BC when the Roman general Pompey the Great, he was called Pompeius Magnus. He was a colleague of Julius Caesar. You all must have heard about Julius Caesar, okay? A name very famous in history, okay? And he was co-ruler with Julius Caesar. There were three of them, it was called the triumvirate, where three men ruled together. Pompey was one of them, Julius Caesar was the other. So Pompeius Magnus, he was co-ruler with Julius Caesar, his colleague and his friend. And much more than Julius Caesar, it was Pompey who commanded great respect in Rome. And Rome at this point of time was a growing, empire. We cannot actually call it an empire because there were no emperors. Rome was a republic. It was a sort of a democracy. We can't call it completely a democracy. A sort of a democracy because it was a group of people, the Senate, which passed on the laws, and also it was more, in political terms we call such a type of government an oligarchy. Okay, so the Senate was the one. So the Senate was all powerful, and here Pompey, he was a ruler along with Julius Caesar. What happened is in the year 63 BC, prior to this period, the whole of Judea was ruled by the Hashmoneans. So you remember the book of Maccabees in the Old Testament? The Maccabees does not constitute part of the canon, okay, for the Protestants and also for the Jewish. In the Jewish canon, they are not there. But in the Christian canon, it is considered to be deuterocanonical, but we still consider it to be part of scripture. And when you read about the Maccabees are none other than the Hashmoneans themselves, okay. So prior to this rule, okay, prior to Rome coming into the, orbit over here, the entire region of Judea, and when we talk about Judea, it was the entire, this is Samaria, Galilee, everything was counted, what we would normally call Palestine today. It was entirely ruled by the Hashmoneans, okay. Rome at this point of time was just a growing power in the east and was still a republic and not an empire. It becomes an empire only after the murder of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. There are certain dates in history which are supposed to be watershed moments, and if you can, you should try to remember these key dates by which you are able to interconnect all the important events that happen in the world. So 44 BC, okay, we know that those 23 senators, how they came and they came with their daggers and they assassinated Julius Caesar right in the Senate. Okay, and after that there was a sort of a big civil war, and much prior to this, Pompey was already dead. But in 63 BC, Pompey was a very powerful figure. And so he steps into, why does he go into Judea? Why does he go into Jerusalem with the armies? Because there was infighting between the Hasmoneans themselves. There were, too many contenders to the throne, and there was one particular faction. I think it was a faction of Hyrcanus. He was a very weak ruler. So they were the ones who had petitioned Pompey to come and help them. So naturally, Rome was a growing power. So when they were petitioned to come and help them, they went ahead. And so Pompey was looking after all the operations of the Romans in the east. But naturally, he was sent over there. The Roman general Pompey was petitioned by one of the factions, okay, the Maccabean rulers, to come to their aid. So he went there. And as I already told you, the entire region constituted Galilee, Perea, Samaria, Judea, everything. And so the moment Pompey, okay, he consolidated power, he got hold, he strengthened that ruler over there, automatically Pompey would not do this for free. It was done with the hope that they would accept their overlordship, and hence from that moment on, okay, the whole region became a client kingdom. They lost their total freedom. They were rulers only in name. Okay, so they became a client kingdom. This is a term you have to remember. The Romans, they pursued this, imperial policy of what they were interested only in money and money and wealth. So they were not much interested in staying in the conquered territories that they had conquered and see that their rule only is carried out. They were very forward looking people. They were only interested in making money and wealth for the empire, and they believed, they pursued that policy of whoever is the ruler who accepts their overlordship, that person would be installed as a ruler, so he would become their client king. Okay, so remember this client king. So this region became a client kingdom owing allegiance to Rome. The Hasmoneans were rulers only in name. This I've already explained. Okay, so the ultimate policy of the Romans was what? To conquer the territories and ensure that taxes came into their coffers, and this is the way Rome finally became a very rich and wealthy empire and one of the greatest history has ever known. So when Pompey gained control of Jerusalem, he was curious to see the temple. This is very interesting. Josephus writes, and that's how we know all this. Okay, in his book called The Antiquities, he gives in detail of this thing. When he conquered Jerusalem, he got hold of Jerusalem, he was very keen to see the temple. Why? Because he had heard a lot about the God of the Jews, the God of the Jews. So he wanted to see, what is this God of the Jews? Who is this God of the Jews? There's so much, the people are so zealous about, their devotion to him. So he wanted to go into the temple because in the ancient world, in Rome, in Greece, all over Mesopotamia and all, whenever one went to a temple, there was always, the temple had a sort of a tripartite this, like how the Jerusalem temple was there, the same way, 3 parts. The innermost used to be the holiest, okay, the holiest place, the inner sanctum, and there the statue of the deity, a huge statue of the deity would be there. And it would be revered, it would be bathed, sometimes dressed, and all this type of thing. They would treat the idol of the deity like as if it was another, person, as an entity. So here, when he came into the Jerusalem temple, he wanted to remember the Jerusalem temple is not the magnificent one that Herod built later. That is yet to come. Prior to this, okay, the temple was not so very magnificent, but the cult in the temple was world renowned and very famous. So he went there. So he not only entered the temple, but he committed an act of sacrilege. He not only entered the temple, but entered the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctum of the holy temple, hoping to carry away the idols of the deity, because whenever a temple was captured, the first thing that would be taken by the victors would be the deity of the statue of the deity, because that was an act symbolic that the gods of the conquerors are superior, and you accept the suzerainty of the victor. So that was the symbolism behind such action. So he went directly to the innermost sanctum of the Holy of Holy, hoping to carry away, thinking that there would be a huge marble statue or something. But Pompey was intrigued on finding it completely empty. What was there in the Holy of Holies? There was nothing. At this point in time, the Jerusalem temple was not yet the imposing, magnificent, largest temple of the ancient world, which Herod the Great would, subsequently transform it out in less than 60 years. But whatever he was shell-shocked and stunned, because what the Jews were worshipping, there is nothing inside. So he just couldn't, comprehend what was happening. Okay. To Romans like Pompey, it was incomprehensible that the Jews would be dedicated to one God. Not only Pompey, but the entire ancient world remained intrigued with the devotion of the Jewish people to a one omnipresent but an invisible and formless God who was beyond human comprehension, so mighty and glorious that he could not be reduced to any forms or images. For the Jews, just as for us too, God was timeless, formless, and present everywhere. And these beliefs of the Jews fascinated the non-Jewish people of the ancient world, who visited the temple to pay respects and give offerings. Remember earlier we have seen how Jesus attacks, like how the Gentiles, they are coming to the temple, but see how the cult of the temple has become so segregated. But that was not the case during the first temple, which was open to everybody, because that was a place where God marked his presence. So to the Romans, Judea, now why were the Romans so much interested in the small little, when you look at the map and you see this Judean hillside and this entire region of Israel and all, it is quite a small little, insignificant, seemingly insignificant piece of land. But why were the Romans so much interested, in putting their stamp over Judea and seeing that it was under their control? Because of easy access to Egypt. To the Romans, Judea was only a tiny piece of a great strategic parcel of land they needed to gain easy access to Egypt. So that was a corridor through which, they could go directly to Egypt. And that was the reason why they were so much interested. Otherwise, why would they, want to have anything to do with the Judeans, and especially they had become people who finally would give them so much of trouble. We will be seeing that all, when the Jewish revolt peaks as a background to all this. But to the Jews, okay, I forgot to tell you here, they wanted Judea only in order to have access to Egypt. And Egypt at this point of time was ruled by the Ptolemies, who were one of the people who belonged to Alexander. Remember when Alexander died, okay, in 323 BC, his territories were, distributed among the Ptolemies, the Seleucids were ruling Syria, and the whole of Egypt was always with the Ptolemies. And the most famous Ptolemy of all is, we all know, Queen Cleopatra. She is yet to come here on the scene. She is probably a very young girl at this point of time. So here, they were eyeing Egypt because they wanted the granaries of Egypt. So finally, Rome wanted control of all the territories, but in particular, Judea was important to them because it was a corridor to Egypt. But to the Jews, Judea was a promised land given to them by God to be theirs alone. And to retain this land, they would fight to death. We know it even today. when we read in the papers and all, we know what's happening. Now see how Israel is bombarding Palestine, because they always, lay claim to the biblical legacy, saying that was a promised land which was directly given to them by God. And so they are the first claimants to that. And that is the way they just justify even to the point of genocide, which, to our mind sometimes is so very senseless. But this is the spirit that actually drives them. So this clash of cultures between the Romans and the Jews would lead to a vicious and bloody conflict that would last not only from then on for almost 200 years. And worse, for the Jewish people, it was to be a conflict that would pit Jew against Jew as never before. We will be seeing that was the most horrible part of the first Jewish revolt, which ended up in the burning of the temple. Those rebels and the Jewish, we will be seeing all these leaders. Ultimately they fought the Romans, no doubt. But prior to that, there was a bloody civil war. They captured Jerusalem, wouldn't allow people who were all trapped inside, the temple precincts, wouldn't allow them to go. And that is how we have such a huge toll. Josephus tells us that 1.1 million people were slaughtered during the Jewish revolt, and more within the precincts of the temple. Okay, so we will see this. The sad part of it is, no doubt, it was a clash between these two civilizations, the Romans on one hand, the Jews on the other. But the saddest part was the Jewish revolt brought about, civil wars. And civil wars are always intern-assignments. They are mutually damaging. They damage each other. And that's exactly what happened to the Jewish people. They would never remain the same again. These are some pictures I put out how, Pompey is coming. These are the priests over here, you can see. The priests were called Kohanim. This is the way they used to dress up in white linen garments with that head cap and all. Okay, and Pompey is coming here with all his might. He was a very dashing Roman general. He was the one, Pompey's name would send strike terror in the hearts of the people. So here he is coming. And with his characteristic style and charisma, he must have just, went on marching inside and wanted to see the Holy of Holies. And this priest must have been so frightened. They say, Josephus tells us that as he came marching also inside, the priest did not stop with their sacrificial cult. It was going on. And he went on ahead and pulled aside, the Holy of Holies used to have a huge curtain. So he pulled aside the curtains. Here he is standing. Okay, he was curious to see the temple. He gets entry and he comes very close to the Holy of Holies, pulls up the curtain, and what he sees over there, Josephus writes very beautifully. He tells us in his account, there was nothing that affected the nation in all the calamities they went under than that the holy place, which is never to be seen by none, should be laid open to strangers. So this was, a big wound to the Jewish people. What Pompey did, okay, with complete disregard to the religious sensibilities of the Jewish people of Jerusalem, okay, what he did was an unforgivable act. But at that point of time, they were a very small, so they couldn't really retaliate, and so Pompey goes away. But Pompey, he says, but Pompey went where it was not lawful for anyone except the high priest to enter. It is a mistake there, it's not high priest to enter. Because it was only the high priest, and that also only on one particular day in the year, that is Yom Kippur, okay, the day of atonement, the day of great, repentance. I'm not talking about the national day of mourning, this is a different one. So only on the day of Yom Kippur, when huge sacrifices, rams and bulls and all would be slaughtered, that blood of the bulls and all would be taken and it would be strewn around there in the Holy of Holies. That was the only time the high priest was allowed to enter. So here Pompey is going and he commits this act of sacrilege, which was not lost on the people. Now coming back, so from here, you see this resentment between the Jewish people and the Romans, because the Romans would not understand their religious sensibilities, and they were always, clashing and at loggerheads. Now coming back to the scene, At this point of time, when we talk about first century, Jerusalem, when we talk about Jerusalem, we mean the whole of Judea. Okay? There was not one type of Judaism. If anybody asks you, what was Judaism like? Was there, a single unified belief and attitudes, be it even towards their own religion? And we know, as we have gone through the details in the Gospel of Mark, how the Pharisees would constantly be in debate. There would be the scribes, then Jesus, clashing also with the Sadducees, because each of them had their own ideologies. Each of them held on to attitudes and beliefs which they felt were supreme. So each one only upheld the supremacy of their own beliefs with complete disregard to the other. And that is why in the first century Jerusalem, at the time of Jesus, it is normally said by scholars that there were various forms of Judaisms. There wasn't one single, Judaism, one sort of, concrete, set of core beliefs that you could say that this is the whole thing that is meant for everyone. It wasn't like that. Let us have a look here. The Jews of the first century in the land of Israel were not unified in their attitudes, also in their beliefs, and most so towards their attitudes towards Rome. Disagreement between the Jews as to how to respond to Roman rule would trigger a very fierce civil war, which we will see now. The physical violence between the groups, as we will see, how it became so bloody, and the massacres that they indulged in both the sides. The physical violence between the groups emerged from the depths of their spiritual conflicts and the differences in their ideology. Because remember, when the full-blown revolt actually broke out, it was not only a fight between the Romans and the Jews, but it was more Jews against Jews. So each group believed that it alone understood the true will of God revealed in scriptures, and each had nothing but contempt for all who disagreed. We have seen how the Sadducees differed in their beliefs. They wouldn't accept the resurrection. They did not consider the prophetic corpus as part of scripture. They said, no, we only believe in the Torah, and the Torah is supreme and nothing beyond that. Pharisees had a different take on the whole thing. They had multiplied the laws and the commandments so much that it came finally to the figure of 613. So each of them were interpreting scriptures and religious beliefs the way they wanted. And each one believed that theirs was supreme. So Jerusalem, and so they would have contempt for all who disagreed with them. So Jerusalem or Judea, Jerusalem is just that small city on the hill, but Judea is the entire region, okay, including the countryside, was in the throes of a cultural chaos. So if anybody had to have an outsider, had to have a look over there, it was like a boiling cauldron. Each one was hanging on only to their own, to their own system of beliefs. So it looked like as if the whole of Judea was in the throes, okay, of a cultural chaos. Different groups were fighting or vying with each other for Jewish allegiances. So notions of Judaism too were divided. So there was no single notion that could completely define Judaism. Now let us see who were the dominant groups, because until and unless you know who were the dominant groups and how, what role each of them played finally in bringing down the temple, because we can really say each of them played a role in actually, bringing down the temple, actually forcing the Romans to come in hot pursuit of them, carry out a 4 month siege by which finally they burnt the temple to the ground. So each had a role to play. Now who were these groups and how do we know about them? Again, our greatest source is always Josephus, because he's the one who was an eyewitness to all these things. Not only an eyewitness, he was a participant in these events, a fact which we should not forget. And I will be elaborating his role in further detail in the next session. First, let us have a look at the dominant groups that were there in Jewish society. Josephus tells us that there were 4 groups which he called philosophies. Okay, he defines them. He doesn't call them groups, he calls them philosophies. First, we all know the Pharisees. I will not elaborate on them because we have dwelled on them at length. So the Pharisees were the dominant group and they were the ones who were the beloved of the masses. Then we had the Sadducees who were a minority group, okay, but they are the ones who comprise the high priesthood. So they were in charge of the temple and its cult, and they were just a small clan, a group of powerful aristocratic families, which I told you not more than five to six, who were the most influential. Though they were just a minority group, they were the most influential and wealthy because they were the ones who actually were the collaborators with the Roman conquerors. And this is exactly the accusation the rebels would always make against them. They accused them of being traitors and collaborators with the Romans, something that they deeply despised. Okay, so the Sadducees, these are the Jerusalem temple priesthood. We have the Pharisees. So, and we have to remember that when we talk about Sadducees, though they were just a small group, a small clan of families, the temple was very important for them. Why? Because it was a bank, okay, it was a political and economic heart of Jerusalem. It was not only a religious center where the temple cult carried on 24/7, but for the high priest and his allies, the temple cult was not only a seat of religious faith, but a source of great wealth and power, which we have already dwelled upon at great length in the previous sessions. And hence, so long as the Romans did not interfere in their religious practices, they were willing to help the Romans rule Jerusalem as active collaborators. Remember in the previous session, I think somebody asked, were the Sadducees not against the Romans? No, they were not against the Romans. In fact, they were active collaborators with the Romans. Why? Because they were the ones who were helping the Romans to keep the peace over there. So how to, conduct administration of the land, how to arrange for, because collecting taxes itself is a massive administrative exercise. Who would do it on behalf of the Romans? They need somebody to do it. So it was definitely the Sadducees, the Jerusalem priesthood, the high priest and his allies. They were the ones who would collect all the taxes and deposit them with the Romans. And we have to also remember the temple was also a court, a judicial court. It was like the Supreme Court. So it was a Supreme Court, it was a bank, it was a place where religious faith found its expression. But above all, it was a place of great economic activity which brought in huge wealth into the temple treasury. And we have all seen who were the ones who benefited the most. It was these aristocratic priests. So this was the reason, because why did they have this type of policy with the Romans? Well, for them, they were very happy with this establishment because nobody wanted to, sort of jerk their cart. They were happy with this arrangement because the Romans they were like their protectors. They were ensuring that, there was peace and stability, because the moment there was instability and the temple cult would be rocked, it would stop the sacrifices and money and wealth would stop flowing into the coffers of the temple. And this is something that the high priesthood would never want. So they were active collaborators. Why? Because they used the Romans in order to consolidate their own position, and that is why they were willing to help the Romans rule Jerusalem as active collaborators. And this was the reason the Jewish rebels, whom we will be calling later the Zealots, accused them of being traitors and collaborators with the Romans. This is the Pharisees we have already touched, okay? This is how, they were the greatest interpreters of the Torah for the masses at the synagogue assemblies. They would be the teachers of the common people. Now we have looked at the Pharisees, we have looked at the Sadducees, as Josephus calls them, philosophies. There is a third group of people that Josephus highlights. That is the Essenes and the Qumranites. Let us see who these people. Has anybody ever heard about them? Have you heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Because this is a very common word now. If you are a person who loves archaeology and all and goes through all archaeological articles and all, this is definitely something that you will frequently come across. So the Essenes or the Qumranites, let us see who they were. Now when this endless circle of violence that was going on, okay, well, the Zealots on one side, the Sadducees, they are accusing them, the Pharisees, they are trying to hold the peace. But at the same time, there was endless, circle of violence going on, especially what was perpetrated by the Zealots, it's going to come in the next this, okay. So these Qumranites and the Essenes, when they saw this endless circle of violence going on, these were the people who believed that God did not want them to fight the Romans. He wanted them to prepare for the end of days. So this was, a very unique group, a monastic community that lived along the spot shores of the Dead Sea, and they were called the Essenes. On the lifeless scorched shores of the Dead Sea, okay, lived a group of Jews called the Essenes. If you look at the landscape near the Dead Sea, it is the harshest Judean part of the desert. And in that scorched, landscape, these people, they were a thriving monastic community. Let us have a look. And perhaps if Josephus had not to tell us about this, there would be very scant information ever about them. They wouldn't have even been known to history. Of course, finally, when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1946, that would become a world-shattering discovery. But to make the connection that these were the people who were behind the writing of the Dead Sea Scrolls would be very difficult without Josephus mentioning in his work. So they were the monastic community, a community of sort of monks, now called the Qumran community. Today scholars refer to them as the Qumran community, or the community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, the most enduring legacy that they bequeathed to the modern world. They were a sectarian group. What is the meaning of sectarian group? A group that is, like a sect, wherein entry to a group is very much restricted. There are strict rules that you have to adhere to in order to attain membership to such groups. Those are called sectarian groups. So this was a very, strictly speaking, a sectarian group that withdrew from the world into an apocalyptic landscape that reminded them every moment that the end was near. You ever go to the Dead Sea, like you can just imagine looking at the photographs. We never had, we didn't have the opportunity to actually visit this area, but when you look at the photographs, it is a very grim landscape. It is like a God-forbidden place where nobody would ever want to go over there. And so this landscape is referred to as an apocalyptic landscape, like, something wherein nothing good will come out, which will remind you that, this is the end of the world, the limit of harshness that you can experience over there, that is the end of it. So they pulled themselves out from the world, and they went and built this community precisely because this was the ideology. They felt that the end times were near, the end was near. To them, that was the only explanation as to why God had allowed the Romans to occupy Judea. See how they would, connect. They had the same beliefs like the Jews. They believed in the might of God. They believed in the one Jewish God. They believed in Yahweh as the one God who would, command their complete devotion, their complete dependence on Him. Then how is it that such a God who cared about His community, who cared and loved His people, how would He allow the Romans to come and occupy Judea? So they connected this, and since they were people, later slide I will be sharing, they were people who reflected very deeply, especially on the book of Daniel. And the book of Prophet Daniel is full of this type of apocalyptic visions of the end times. And so they were driven by this type of understanding that the end is coming near. And that is why they withdrew to the desert to prepare themselves for the coming of the Messiah. They actually believed that two Messiahs would come, a kingly Messiah and a priestly Messiah. And so they felt that God had specially called them to live there in the desert to prepare for His coming. To them, that was the only explanation as to why God would allow the Romans to occupy Judea. So they interpreted the Roman occupation of Judea as a sign of the coming of the end of the age. the notion arose that there must be a final act of God, the end of days, which they call, we have their writings today, okay, their writings from which we come to know what was their mind. They believed in the final act of God, which they call the end of days, by which God would make all things right in this world. And they lived in the Judean desert near that place is called Khirbet Qumran. This is a place that overlooks the Dead Sea, and that is how, okay, since those sites have been discovered and greatly excavated along Qumran, they are referred to as a Qumran community. They led a life of prayer, they led a life of celibacy, they wouldn't marry, they wouldn't take wives, okay, and complete devotion to the Torah. They strived to live as perfectly as possible until the time the Messiah would come. And this was their belief. So they neither aligned with the Pharisees nor with the Zealots, and definitely not. They had a very harsh view of the Jerusalem priesthood. I will share that with you. So this is the landscape. Okay, you see over here, completely barren, like, it's unimaginable that somebody will make this area habitable. To even build up a community is something very, very difficult to comprehend and understand. We know of these Essenes from the writings of the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who writes. He mentions specifically also the numbers. They were more or less 4,000 of them. Pharisees, he gives the number around 6,000. And for the Essenes, he comes down to the number 4,000. There are about 4,000 of these men who live in this way and never marry wives. They teach the immortality of the souls, unlike the Sadducees. Okay, so they teach the immortality of souls and esteem that the rewards of righteousness be earnestly striven for, that we strive for that. So this was their belief that drove them to the desert to live in these communities. How do we know how Josephus knows so much about, their life, like, because it was very difficult to find acceptance in that community, because not anyone could enter that community. It was very, very strict. There was a period of formation and all that you had to undergo. So unless you join there as a novice and undergo formation like how you all do in your religious communities, it was difficult for them to accept an outsider. So Josephus tells that he himself had spent some time over there. Maybe as a young man, he was making up his mind. He was, attracted to the ideology, to the ideals, and wanted to live a life like them. They were great fans of the book of Daniel. Now, what were the beliefs of this Qumran community? They believed that everything was preordained by God. Everything. God has already planned everything. Everything is destined. And that when the end of days arrived, there would be a 40 years war between the forces of good and the forces of evil. They believed they were the forces of good, and that is why they called themselves the sons of light. And everybody else, even including other Jews who were not part of their community, they would call them the sons of Belial, okay, those forces of evil. They believed that the end of those 40 years of war, okay, which was preordained by God, at the end of it, they would be the final victors of them. And they believed, this was the strongest of all the beliefs, they believed that the Jerusalem temple priesthood was corrupt and the cult they practiced was defiled and corrupt. So they would never go into the Jerusalem temple, never take part in any of its worship and sacrificial cult. Okay, they believed that they were the true Israel. And if you look closely at their sectarian writings, okay, at the beliefs that so much they cherished, they closely resemble, they felt like as if they were the tabernacle in the desert, like how, when the Israelites were wandering in the desert for 40 years, they were taking along the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle. So they felt that they were like the tabernacle, and just like, the tabernacle moved in the desert, their calling to was, to renounce the world, withdraw from the world and come and live in the desert, preparing for the future coming of God. So that is the reason, okay, they took precisely to come and live in Khirbet Qumran. They believed in a strong eschatology based on the book of Daniel, believing that the end time was near and that God would come to establish His true community in the world through His sons of light, that is, they themselves, by defeating the forces of darkness, okay, whom they would call sons of Belial. In their writings, we find this dreadful prediction about the end time. They had made this prediction which finally comes true. It will be a time of trouble, the like of which has never been seen since the nation came into being. At that time, your people will be rescued, all who are inscribed in the book, and those who lead the many to righteousness will be like the stars forever. So this is the prediction. They said that when the end of world is coming, which they believed was coming when the Romans already occupied, okay, from 63 on, they felt the end time was near. And so they observed rigid purity regulations meant for the priest, whatever was laid down. You remember we have seen the purity regulations, especially for the priest, as laid down in the book of Leviticus in the Torah. They practiced all that. Why? Because they believed that they were the true priests and the Jerusalem temple priesthood was all corrupt and bogus and defiled. They had common meals, and before joining the community, they had to undergo formation and renounce all claims to property. They couldn't hold any property before becoming a full member. And only male members were admitted. So when you see, okay, the remains there in Khurbat Qumran, their graves and all have been excavated, they are found. They were all male skeletons. A few females, just some 2 or 3 skeletons of females have been found. And scholars, they surmise that maybe these were the people who helped the community getting goods maybe for their sustenance. So they considered themselves to be the true priest of the future temple. And most importantly, they followed their own calendar, and that is the solar calendar, unlike the lunar calendar followed by the temple priesthood. The Jewish people, they had their own calendar. The calendars were very important to mark the days, okay, the important days of assembly, the important days of feast. So for any religion, the calendar is, of critical importance. And so here, when we see, compare the lives of the Qumran community with the ordinary Jewish people, they had their different days. Like for example, for them, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, was a different day. When it was Day of Atonement for the normal Jewish people, as celebrated in the Temple of Jerusalem, that was not what was celebrated by them, because the calendar they followed was a solar calendar of 365 days. Whereas the lunar calendar had lesser days, I think around 19 days less, because they would calculate the days on the lunar cycle. So they had their own different calendars. And since they were living there in the desert, they had access to no luxuries, okay, they lived a life of complete austerity. Their meals also were extremely frugal, okay, so very austere living. So what would they do? Of course, they spent a lot of their time in prayer, but something more important than that also they did. They spent most of their time copying scrolls of Hebrew scriptures and other sacred texts. They also composed beautiful hymns called the Hudayat. It's a collection of huge, beautiful hymns that are, they actually composed all in praise of God, saying praise to His beauty, to His goodness, to His providence, to His power. So this collection of the hymns that are very unique to the Qumran community are called the Hudayat, and they possess psalms that number more than 2,000. Have you ever come across psalms more than 150? In our Old Testament, okay, in our Catholic canon, and also in the Jewish canon, there are only 150 psalms. Some depending on the translation. In some this collections you will find 151 psalm, because one psalm is repeated, but nowhere in any other canon you will find more than 150 psalms. But when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, okay, and that also by accident, when one of the Bedouins, I think he hit a stone and he heard the clank of some jar breaking in the high cliffs. That's how they came to know, and this was way back in 1946. 647, one of the day. I think that was the year when Israel also got its, Israel was formed as a nation. That is the same year. So these psalms, okay, we only knew 150 psalms. So we come to know from this corpus of the Dead Sea Scrolls, more than 2000 scrolls, okay, some are small, small, tiny scraps, but it was the desert conditions that preserved them, and they were kept in the jars by them, by this Qumran community, okay. So we do not know which are the, even the texts, sometimes they are far more original, earlier than what were written by the other scholars, copied by the temple scholars. So this is the beauty of the collection that finally they ended up doing. So they would do it all, when they were there. So most of the time, their time was spent in prayer, okay, in communal meals, but mostly in copying scrolls. And they had specially a place there called the scriptorium, where they had all these parchments, the scrolls and all. Even the ink and the stylus and all these things have been discovered. So it is a very, the archaeological discoveries have shed a lot of light on really what was their life. There was also a surmise that John the Baptist also, he early on, he started out from there. So he must have had some, we do not know, he probably must have been a member of the sect earlier and probably left and went away. But Jesus and Qumran is very difficult to reconcile, because Jesus' vision was so very inclusive. He would never consider other sons of the devil, and I alone am the son of light. Would you ever find Jesus talking like that? But the Qumran community did hold such a very rigid belief that they alone were the sons of light and none other. Okay? So definitely, maybe there might be some influences, some commonalities between Christian beliefs and the Qumran communities, but definitely we cannot say that, for certain that Jesus was influenced by the teachings of the Qumran community. He must have known about them definitely, being a Jew of the first century. They stored their writings in caves they found in the high cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea. It was a plan that showed remarkable foresight, for two of their predictions would come true. What they had said, you remember that the prediction I shared in the earlier slide, a time of trouble that any had seen before was coming, and it did come when the Romans came, okay, and unleashed their full wrath on the rebels during the first Jewish revolt. We know what really happened. And the DSS, that is the Dead Sea Scrolls, would survive to tell their story despite 2000 years of writing them having passed. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which is the greatest legacy they bequeathed to the modern world, contains scrolls of all books of the Hebrew Old Testament. We always felt that the earliest copies were the Septuagint, but this was much, much earlier. Okay, so the Dead Sea Scrolls, okay, it is a legacy we have inherited from them. And they have all the books of the Hebrew Old Testament except the book of Esther. It's very intriguing that only Esther does not find, not a single copy of the scroll is found there. Altogether 12 caves. All these Dead Sea Scrolls were not, discovered in one lot. Over the years, more and more caves were discovered. As of now, 12 caves were discovered. The greatest collections were found in Cave 4 and Cave 1. Okay, so who knows, maybe there are more caves to be discovered. Only coming years will be able to tell us. The settlement, the sad part is, the settlement at Qumran was tragically destroyed in 68 AD. Remember, the Jewish revolt broke out in 66 AD. Just 2 years later, that was a time of Emperor Nero. Nero was still there when the revolt broke out. So he sent Vespasian as a Roman general to crush the revolt in Judea. And when Roman general Vespasian, who would become the future emperor later, he came down with such a heavy hand. So as he was coming from north to south, whatever came in his way, he just went on slaughtering en masse. We had that very famous of Josephus, where he himself was a commander at Chotapata, which I will be taking the next session. We also have Mary Magdalene's village of Magdala was totally destroyed by Vespasian's marauding armies. So most of the members of the community were probably slaughtered by the advancing Romans. They say that this was a monastic community, but there was a parallel community, okay, of lay people, okay, who adhered to the rule but not strict. The celibacy was not practiced by them, and they lived among the people in the world, and so that was a sort of a lay branch of the community. Only that seems to have survived, and we get a faint, whisper of that in the book of Acts, where there's a line where Luke mentions, and many priests joined the movement. Now, which priest would join the movement? The only priests were the Levitical priests. They were small in number. And the Jerusalem priesthood, they were arch enemies of Jesus. So definitely we have to discount them. So scholars surmise that, when Luke mentions that many priests joined the nascent Christian community, they probably were the branch of the Essenes who came and joined them, because their beliefs more or less aligned with the new faith. This is the way. High up in the cliffs, they would go and put them in the jars, and that's how they remain preserved. Now we come to the fourth, that is the Zealots. The Zealots, Judas, the son of Hezekiah the bandit. How much time do we have? Oh my God, it's already 21:42. Shall we continue? Because this is going to be quite a lot. I think I will take it up in the next session, because I won't finish it even in another 15 minutes. Shall we take this forward to the next session? Could somebody unmute and say? We are already nearing 10:45.
No problem, but the other sisters may be able.
What about the others? Shall we take this forward for Monday?
Yeah, no problem, Mama. I just had a question, if you could clarify the end of this. Thank you.
Yes, please ask better, more questions if
Right.
you can.